All right, well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Matt Goodman. I work on international economics here at CSIS, and delighted to work with Bill and colleagues on this interesting event. And we hope to this session, this breakout session, which is called "Out with the Old, In with the New," which is about the old order, the new order, the WTO. Should it be salvaged? Is it worth salvaging? And how to do that. If you were intending to be somewhere else, either in the 3 zeros session, that's over there, or the China session, that's over there. But we're delighted to see a good group here on this somewhat arcane topic, but I think a very important one to this conversation, because obviously the order, the framing of institutions and rules that has governed international trade, basically since World War II, is clearly under stress. And the fundamental question that we're asking here is whether it is under such stress that it is unfixable, and whether in fact we need to try something different. And so that's the kind of fundamental question we're addressing here. We're probably going to end up talking about a lot of things. We're not probably going to get into the arcana, the details of the dispute settlement mechanism and special and differentiated treatment and arcana of the WTO, unless you want to. Because, by the way, as Bill, I think, said in the earlier session, we're meant to very much involve you guys in this, because at the end of this session, or these breakout sessions, the facilitators are coming back on stage with Bill to report out, and I'm supposed to report out on behalf of this group what our kind of broad areas of conversation were, but even if we can, to try to come to some sort of broad consensus on some aspects of this set of questions. That may be impossible and probably will be, but at least we're going to try. And so stay tuned, because I'm going to actually pull you into the conversation. In fact, I'm going to do that in 1 second. As soon as I just quickly introduce the two speakers here, we're sort of doing an Oxford-style debate of a pro and con, the topic at hand. And shockingly, Derek is the con. But first, Cathy Novelli. I think both of these people are well known to this audience, I'm sure. But Cathy Novelli is president of Listening for America, which is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to forging a new vision of U.S. international trade engagement. And as everyone knows, she was Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment in the Obama administration. And before that was at Apple and USTR and other places. We all know Cathy well. And she's going to speak in a second. On my other side, I'm not going to say politically which side, Derek Scissors, again, is also well known. He's at the American Enterprise Institute, and he focuses on Chinese and Indian economies and U.S. relations with Asia. He has a very well-known China investment tracker, which is a really important asset for all of us, and very helpful. We use it a lot here at CSIS, and so appreciate Derek's work. You'll find that, as he just indicated, Derek doesn't have very strong opinions about these or other topics, so we're going to have to pull some of that out of him. Before I have them speak, though, what I'd like to do is I want to just get a show of hands as a kind of lay down here. Basic question related to the topic at hand here, which is, from the viewpoint of U.S. interests. Okay, so I know there are others in this room who are representing foreign governments and so forth, but put yourself in the shoes of the United States and our interests. From the U.S. perspective, I'm going to be more specific in this first question than just the order generally, but is the WTO salvageable? Is it worth salvaging for the U.S. interests, or do we need to do something? Do we need to have some new institution, new approach to regulation of international trade? And so that's the kind of fundamental question. So if you believe and I think broadly speaking, we all are either believers that flawed as the system is, it can and should be reformed, or we believe it's so flawed that it cannot be reformed. And even if that's a 51-49 proposition, I want to kind of push you to vote one way or the other, just so we can get a sense right now of whether we think that the existing order, especially the WTO part of it, is is worth fixing and is fixable, or not, and we need to try something new. So if you're in the first camp, in other words, think that the WTO and the order around it is salvageable and worth salvaging, can you raise your hand now? Raise it high so we can see. We're not going to count hands, but I just want to get a general sense, okay? And I'm going to, in this case, I'm going to be player manager, and I'm going to vote on that side.
See, I'm outnumbered.
Okay. There we go.
Make that clear.
If you believe that we need to kind of throw it out and start something new, try a new approach, please raise your hand. Okay, a small but significant number.
You'll get your money later.
Okay, maybe we're going to ask the question again, and we'll see whether folks have a different view. But let me start by letting Derek go first and lay down a few thoughts. Go ahead.
Yeah. So CSIS does a number of events. This looks really good. I will say they've clearly made a mistake because the title of this event is A Positive Trade Agenda, and they invited me. So nobody's perfect. So my point is not that we should leave or try to actively destroy the WTO, but it is that we should just ignore it. So I hope that isn't too weak a counterpoint to the salvage claim. And I'll start with a country I know best, which is China, but I won't end there. So if this is going to be a little bit China-focused, but it won't be confined to China. And in fact, I'll criticize the United States as well. And, some people have a gift, and that's mine, criticizing everybody. IP and subsidies are the biggest issues we have with the Chinese. And let's look at how tractable those are. The Chinese previously promised to abide by WTO rules on coerced tech transfer. They claim they have, and that multinationals voluntarily hand over the tech in exchange for market access, that they're not being coerced. So either they've abided by the letter of the WTO rule, and the WTO in this area, which is crucial to the United States, remember we're talking about it from an American perspective, is useless, or, I can't really believe I need a microphone, but,
That's true.
Or they haven't even abided by the letter, and we have a major member that has cheated and lied for years with no WTO action. So either the WTO in this area, which is probably the most important point for the United States right now in our policy, has been useless, or worse. We've had active cheating, and the WTO has done zero about it. On subsidies, I don't think it gives away too much in the talks. We have not been able to get the Chinese side to even budge on subsidization of SOEs, while wielding a tariff gun that probably many of you think is excessive and dangerous. I see no possibility, under direct threat from their most important trade partner in terms of supplying foreign exchange, which is crucial to the Chinese at this point, that a WTO reform is going to convince them of anything. And I don't know what people here are going to say. I'm going to pick out an argument that none of you may have, but I've heard it repeatedly, so I'm going to attack it preemptively. And I apologize if this discredits anyone's view, because you wouldn't make this argument. The whole idea of saying the world is going to convince the Chinese it's in their interest to reform is absurd. And just stop it. And if you don't want to stop it, and we go down that path, please contact me, because I will bet Mitt Romney money that it will fail. And if you don't follow American politics, that's $10,000 that you mention at the drop of a hat. It's not as trivial to me as it is to Mitt, but I'm very confident that I'd win that bet. So we're not going to convince the Chinese to change on subsidization of SOEs. That's silly. They're not even moving an inch under threat. Now, the U.S. could make bigger threats, but the WTO can't. So on subsidization, the WTO is also useless. I'll make one more point, which is China-specific, sort of, but it's more general than that, and also gives me a chance to take a shot at TPP, which I love doing whenever I'm at CSIS. Broad agreements take a long time to implement. They take a long time to modify. Violations of those agreements take a long time to litigate, using the word litigate loosely. China can change its practices really fast. Maybe competitive neutrality in the TPP was the best that could be negotiated. I'm not making an argument that I know how the negotiations went, because I don't. But I will say that with regard to disciplining China, the TPP provisions on competitive neutrality were an utter failure. Chinese could have made adjustments in no time at all. So, the TPP is smaller and more agile, presumably, than the WTO. And there is no way those provisions could have worked to discipline the Chinese. It's an illustration of large multilateral agreement versus speed of the China's ability to change their policy. All right, so I said I wasn't going to talk about China. Let's talk about that wonderful friend of multilateral trade, India. The latest from the Indians, and I won't go over the whole history because it's rather sordid, is they're balking at the e-commerce rules. And the reason I think this is negotiating new e-commerce rules, I think this is relevant, is it touches on core Indian refusals. Don't touch our ability to tax, because we're always spending more money than we bring in, so we need ability to tax. And we consider almost everything to be a violation of our sovereignty. And you add to that the Indians' longstanding protection of their farmers, and the main problem in Indian farming is that the average plot size is shrinking. Nothing to do with the WTO. But the Indians act as if all international trade is a threat to a domestic situation they themselves have created. I don't see how the WTO improves India on any of these items. Their protection of their tax revenue, their prickliness on sovereignty, their own mismanagement of the rural land situation. India is a major player in the WTO, not China level, but major. We again see WTO's inability to act. And let's not forget the biggest player in the WTO, the United States. The 232 on steel and aluminum was pretty dubious. The 232 on cars is potentially 6 times bigger, and it's much more dubious. The U.S. is abusing the national security loophole, if you want to call it that, in the WTO. I criticize China all the time. Sometimes people associate me with the Trump administration. The 232 on cars is a terrible idea. What's the WTO going to do about it? It's not going to do anything effective. We are moving from a world where the national security provisions in the WTO, the vague, let countries do what they want provisions, is an irritant to being a major barrier. It's because of us. The WTO can't discipline us either. So it can't discipline the Chinese, it can't discipline the Indians, it can't discipline the United States. If I knew anything about Europe, I'd throw the Europeans in there too. All right, what's the alternative? And I'll try to be quick here. The start of the alternative, it has to be unilateral. And a lot of you are thinking, great, we're going to have a unilateral alternative to the WTO led by Donald Trump. Okay, I can see why that isn't appealing, but remember that 8 months ago, Congress passed a reform of U.S. investment law on an enormously bipartisan basis, which is now being emulated by our partners. Not copied, emulated. That was a big step in the right direction, not perfect. We can do this where we make up our minds on our own policy and other people take a cue from that. They adapt it to their own circumstances. They say, this is good, this is not good. We cannot do that when we haven't settled our own minds on IP enforcement. And I can tell you right now, we have not settled our own minds within this administration. Forget the Congress, the parties, the public on IP enforcement. Talking about the WTO fixing that policy when the U.S. has not made up its own mind is fantasy. It's ridiculous. We have to make up our own minds first. I haven't traced out how that looks because it's going to look different in different topics. It's going to look different on IP than it does on subsidies, than it did on investment. But the first thing is the U.S. gets its own house in order. Now, I will close on one bit of good news, which is rare for me, but I don't think the system really needs the WTO to be an active, vibrant, working institution because I think the system is based on the dollar. And as long as the U.S. is responsible with dollar provision, we will still have a globalized international economic system. Now, you might say, well, the federal deficit doesn't look like the U.S. is being responsible with the dollar system, but the overall U.S. debt burden is down because of lower private sector debt as a share of GDP. Foreign holdings of treasuries fell a bit in 2018. The Fed is quite globally conscious, if not perhaps too much. The core of globalization historically is U.S. wealth growth and monetary accommodation of that globalization. It's not the WTO. So I'm not throwing out the global economy in my view because I think the global economy is actually based on U.S. wealth and use of the dollar, not the WTO. But I think the WTO at this point cannot possibly solve the problems we have with China, India, or the United States.
Okay, well, not much to work with there, Derek. We may have to call you back in to make something, say something provocative that we can work with. So that's great, thanks. Cathy, you don't have to respond to that. Just give us your thoughts on, the question of the WTO or more broadly the trading system, the order more broadly, and how you see it and the possibilities of fixing it or whether we need to start over.
Great, thanks, Matt. Well, I think what I'd like to do is go back to pre-WTO, pre-GATT, which was kind of the precursor, and just remember a little history here, which is when there was no system, there was chaos. A lot of people think that the protectionism that was going on in the U.S. with Smoot-Hawley tariffs and other tariffs, many others, and in other countries, was at least a significant contributor to the Great Depression. And so I guess from my standpoint, I would not argue that the WTO is perfect, nor would I argue that it's going to solve every problem that we encounter today. But I think that a lack of a system would not serve our interests. And so I think a system, as you said, Matt, as imperfect as it may be, is better than no system. And the system that is in place now definitely needs augmenting. Will it solve every single problem? I would argue it would not. But trying to frame a system that's going to solve every single problem, I think, is maybe beyond just an exercise in futility, maybe losing focus on, what is it that a system can do. And what has the WTO done? It's brought down tariffs worldwide. It has put in place some sort of basic rules. And yes, there are those who don't follow those rules to the letter in every time, but by and large, those basic rules are there and they provide some stability. And I think that is very important. The other thing the WTO does is it has what's called the Trade Policy Review Mechanism, and I apologize if that's arcane, but it is an incredibly detailed look at every country in the WTO and what is going on in their system, where the other member countries can ask questions and document what's going on. There's a review every 2 years of the big countries, US, EU, China, and then less frequently others. So it provides us some transparency. Again, I'm not trying to say it's 100% perfect, but it does give us a foothold, and I think that's very important. I would agree that, there's our issues of noncompliance. I think that the problem, however, is that the conundrum is that if you start down a path where you say, well, okay, we need to force everybody to comply, and the WTO is going to be the mechanism through which that force takes place, then you're basically limiting our ability to do unilateral things, and you're limiting every country's sovereignty. And I don't think it's realistic that we, the U.S. or most other countries, would agree to have an international body control, their economic decision-making in that way. And the way the WTO is set up is there are consequences for bad behavior that's been adjudicated, so there are consequences. At the same time, if you decide you don't want to make a change, as the EU did in many of the cases that we've had with them over the years, for political reasons or other reasons, you have to suffer the consequences. And so does that mean that you're going to do what lawyers call specific performance, where the WTO is going to say, you must behave in this certain way? No, but I don't think we would want a world where that is the case, where bureaucrats of the WTO are somehow, running our economy. In terms of things that I think can be effective, one of the things that's really slowed down the WTO is the need for consensus. And so that means the smallest country can hold up, major initiatives. And so this sort of going maybe outside the WTO and using the plurilateral approach, I think, has been somewhat effective in certain sectors, like the Information Technology Agreement, which brought down tariffs on information technology products on a worldwide basis. And so I think we need to look at that. That kind of then tucked itself under the WTO, and the WTO expanding to allow for more of that, where you have countries who are like-minded and want to make progress, I think is a very good thing. A couple of other points that I would make. One is the WTO itself isn't the one who decides that it's going to discipline a bad behavior. A country has to decide that they object to something that is going on. So, for example, with respect to technology transfer, the WTO itself isn't going to say, oh, we're undertaking a dispute settlement with you, China, because you're forcing technology transfer. One of the member countries of the WTO would have to complain and bring a case and say, we object to this and it violates these rules and here's how. That said, I think there's a couple of things that also have to be looked at, and one of them is how do we engage on some of these new areas? How do we engage more robustly on services, which at this point is 77% of the U.S. economy? How do we make sure that there's market opening more robustly? And there's a plurilateral negotiation that's kind of moribund right now that I think needs to move forward. How do we engage more on digital trade? We're not going to, again, solve every problem of digital trade through the WTO, but I think having frameworks is useful and important. The other piece of this, I think, and a lot of folks have talked about this a long time, is that it just takes a really long time to go through dispute settlement. And if you're a business, and from my own business perspective, something taking 3 years to get resolved, by that point, if you're in a technology business, you're on to the next thing. So I think trying to really innovate some ways that at least you can get a determination in a more quick way would be very important. Two other things that I would suggest. One is, and I encountered this as undersecretary, there is right now a silo of rules that are governing the environment and countries that are getting together and looking at how can they work together on conservation, on illegal fishing, on various things. And then there's the WTO. And the WTO is just not integrated very well with that. And if we think about the future, I certainly foresee that there's going to be many more agreements that govern the environment, where people are trying to advance more conservation ethics. And the WTO has a real antipathy for that, and has sort of said, no, we're going to reinterpret whether these are valid or not. And I think that meshing really needs to come together, and the WTO can't hold itself above things that a majority of other states are agreeing to. The last thing I would say, and as in my hat as president of Listening for America, we've done 100 listening sessions and focus groups around the U.S. just in the last year, and we're doing more now, and we're talking to people from all walks of life, from factory workers to bank tellers to mayors of cities, so kind of a whole wide range of people, business people. It has been very clear to me not that there's an antipathy towards trade, but there is just a complete void of factual information about not just the WTO, but how does trade work, how do supply chains work, and people really don't understand that. And so what has happened is that there's a lot of misinformation that kind of fills in those gaps, but we found that people actually really do want to know the facts, and they really want to understand this. And so I think there's a huge role of education for the WTO about what does the WTO even do, but also how do open markets work, and why do they benefit the individual. And so the WTO is in its own world. We're all kind of in our own world talking to ourselves in ways that we can talk about arcanity of the things that Matt said we weren't going to talk about. But we can't move forward globally without public support, and I think we really have not done a very good job of that. And so, to me, that is something that we need to think seriously about, and a role that the WTO could fill as well.
Okay, great. Really helpful perspectives from both sides. Not, I mean, very different perspectives, but actually some not necessarily irreconcilable differences there. I want to bring you all in pretty quickly, but let me just ask each a challenge point to each side. So, Derek, first of all, what about the point that before the WTO or the order there was chaos, and in a post-WTO world, is there not a risk of chaos? If everybody does the unilateral thing, isn't that going to potentially, on a net basis, hurt our interests more than the benefits of getting, some specific benefits from a unilateral pressure sort of approach?
Two responses. One, I think, convincing. The other one, maybe not so convincing. There's no comparison to the current system and the pre-war system. Again, as I said, the main driver of globalization is not the WTO. And here's my proof. If the U.S. stops running current account surpluses and stops providing dollars to the world, there's no global currency. That's the end. That's the real story of the 30s. It's not no WTO or no GATT. It's currency blocks. And we are, fixing that. Money is more important than rules in global trade. Sorry, I'm an economist. Most of you are lawyers, maybe. We're natural enemies. Money is more important than rules. So if the U.S. continues to provide the dollars on a reasonable basis, which is at issue, which one place where Cathy and I think agree that we need internal decision making. Maybe I don't want to put words in her mouth, but if the U.S. continues to provide dollars, we're not going back to the 1930s. It's not on the table. Now, a harder question is, well, we have a framework. You want to ignore the framework, is my point of view. That risks like having the framework blow up. But either way, we're creating the potential for instability here. And yes, whenever you create the potential for more instability, and I acknowledge that. I'm not saying, it'll all be stable after, if we ignore the WTO. I'm not claiming that. Whenever you create the potential for more instability, you don't know what the outcome is. Dealing with China a lot, I find that instability is like a four-letter word. And I always say to the Chinese, if you're in a prison somewhere, instability is not a four-letter word. You'd like to get out. I don't consider, in a way that I think is different than the 1990s, is different than the 1960s, I don't consider the stability of the situation to be advantageous to the United States any longer. Right? So, yes, there's instability. And whenever there's instability, you don't go, I know the outcome will be better. I don't know the outcome will be better. I find the risks now more than acceptable because we're in a situation that I think harms American interests. People representing other governments, I'm not speaking on your behalf. I'm talking, this is a debate for the United States. So I'm not making a claim that the world will be better off with a WTO that gets ignored. I'm claiming that the U.S. will be likely better off that the WTO gets ignored.
Okay, great. Cathy, you said that when it was set up in the post-war era, this order, provided these benefits, and that's true. But that was at a time when, as Derek said, it was a different era. There were different players involved. You had basically a group of like-minded advanced countries that were sort of writing the rules for kind of our system, and we were the main players and the main traders. The world has really changed, and now you have these other players, and you have a different set of substantive issues as well. But just, is it not true that, isn't there a point that a country like China, which is a very different model from the one that was envisaged when this order was set up and when the WTO specifically was set up, now has such a large position, has such a different approach, that maybe this is what was set up then is fundamentally not right for this system. And how do you fix the issues, the big issues like SOEs and the fundamental challenge to the sort of market-based system that was the premise of the old system?
Well, so one thing that I would say before I answer your question is I think we are all very obsessed about China and to a secondary extent India. But if you looked at a pie chart, and I wish I would have brought one with me, of who is the largest trading partner of the U.S. overall, by far it's the EU, followed by Canada and Mexico as a bloc. And it's not to say that China is not significant. They are significant. But we can't let only China drive our entire trade policy. And so I think we do have to deal with these issues. I don't disagree with Derek that that China has not been an actor in the system that I think everybody thought when they negotiated the WTO accession of China. I personally believe strongly, having worked also with China for many years, that we have a better shot at doing that in a muscular way if we aren't totally by ourselves. And I think the difficulty of that approach has been that, as somebody was saying that I was speaking with yesterday, a lot of other countries have said, we'll hold your coat while you go into the fray, even if they agree with us. And I think that is something that absolutely has to change. But I do not think that just completely ignoring the whole system and saying we're going to, because we have these other problems here, the things that are in that system are no longer valid. I think they're valid, they just aren't sufficient to deal with the new things. And so we've got to try to pull people together to figure that out. Will that mean that China's going to agree with what that decision is? Maybe not, but I think it puts a lot more pressure on China if it's not just the U.S. versus China by itself.
Okay, so I do want to bring everybody in, and you're now on the spot. Let me first, just to kind of warm you up, ask another simple question. Which is a bigger threat to the WTO and the system around the WTO? Is the United States the bigger threat, or is China the bigger threat today? So if you vote for the U.S. as the bigger threat to the WTO and to the trading order, raise your hands. Okay, if you think China is the bigger threat, raise your hand. But come on, you can't not vote. You have to vote. Okay, let me try again.
It is
if you think you have to vote, that's right. You have to vote. Again, even if it's a 51-49 and you're not really sure, please vote one way or the other, just so we can get a sense of the room. Okay, so U.S. is the bigger threat. Raise your hand if you think the U.S. is. Not a single hand, am I correct?
No,
there's one? I can't see in the light. Two. Okay, there are a couple of hands. All right. China. So that, I presume, is everybody else, okay? And there are one or two people who still don't want to vote, but, okay. All right, with that, let me try and bring people in, and I'm going to call on you if you don't offer, and you can just shout out. We do have microphones, but we're also, I think it's a small enough room that if you just, oh no, I guess because we're recording this, we do actually need to put this on microphone. But just raise your hand, and feel free to just respond to any of this, but let me just also ask that as you go along, we want to try to harvest kind of specific ideas for either reform of the existing system or some new alternative to the existing system. So if you can embed that in your comment more than a question, we would very much appreciate that. I saw this gentleman here first, I think. Yes, you better wait for it because we have we're being recorded.
Peter Rashish with AICGS at Johns Hopkins. I want to start out with Derek's comment about Derek's last comment. I think what you're saying essentially is you're saying from an international relations perspective, the United States should see itself no longer as a status quo power, but as a revolutionary power. I think that's a pretty big leap, and I think we have to really think seriously if that's really where we want to be and be seen. But I do think that it's true that if which is likely the China challenge grows, the United States is going to, I think, Democrat, Republican, right, left, or center is going to be increasingly tempted to use power-based trade tools. So that at least at the minimum there'll be a communications challenge. How do you try to do things on the one hand that support the system while at the same time taking some actions that are more power-based? I think that will take a certain amount of diplomatic finesse to do that at the same time. On recommendations, I do think we have to be careful about making the system and sort of multilateralism per se the value. I think it's what the system, the content in the system, right? You could have a rules-based system that has authoritarian rules, right? So I think it's very important that the system, that when we think about the value of the system, that we see how much does it incarnate liberal values or not. And And in that point, I think that it's just as important to make sure we're injecting as much liberalism into the system as we can, and it may not be that the WTO is the best place to do that, and that does put a strong value on doing things elsewhere, bilaterally, regionally. But I think it's not just having a system. That's important. It's good to have order and rules, but it's the values that those rules project, the primacy of the individual and private interests over state interests, rule of law, openness, regulated competition. Those kind of values are just as important as having a system itself.
Okay, can you pass it to your left, just to the gentleman right there, because he was just efficiency's sake.
Hi, John Phipps with S&P Global. I think the biggest problem with the WTO is the inability to reform. And I would say that because of the major players in the system are going to resist that reform. I can't see China or India wanting to undertake serious reform. So I think you're just stuck from the very start in trying to do something new and fresh. At the same time, I think what you have are some glaring omissions from the WTO. And ultimately, the two have already been mentioned, which is services. The fact that the WTO doesn't adequately address those, and that is really the heart of U.S. competitiveness. And then the other one is, gosh, what was the other one? The need for what essentially is, well, I'd call it, lack of a better way of expressing it, a war on the internet. Essentially what you have is you have governments all over the world trying to capture data, trying to restrict it. And this is going on despite the WTO. The WTO is not even a player in this. And this is where the real progress, the real rules need to be made. And so I think what you're seeing regulations and standards overtaking all the sort of principles of trade, and they're the ones that are really blocking up the system. Thanks.
Can we pass it to Orit, and then we'll work around that table towards the back? Right here, the lady in yellow and blue.
Hi. So I actually think, I agree with you both. I think on the one hand, blowing up the WTO would just cause such fundamental chaos in our system, and I think it needs to be radically reformed to the extent that we can with, the players that we have. On the other hand, to Derek's point, I think, the WTO clearly is not doing a good job and will not be able to do a good job of addressing a lot of the fundamental issues with China and a lot of certainly the internet issues that John raised. So I would like to see a dual strategy of, number one, really reforming, serious reform as much as we can of the WTO, while pursuing a lot of other options outside the WTO. And clearly TPP was a move in that direction, right? We distinctly did it outside the WTO to get a coalition of the willing to push for higher standards. And I think on things certainly like digital, I think it's great to have the WTO involved, but we're not going to get anything close to what we need, right? That's just a given. When you have Russia, when you have all those players involved like China, Russia, India, that are just clamping down on the internet. And so I would really push for a high standards digital agreement outside the WTO, and really pushing as much as we can for the standards we want outside that. And I really think we should do that in as many areas as possible, with as many countries as possible, while, simultaneously, having the WTO as like a floor.
You think those things are consistent? Is there not a risk to the multilateral system by doing these sort of broken off? The principle initially was, cover everything, have everyone in the room, and that was the way to maximize, welfare, but also
right. But we have NAFTA. We've had agreements out, and every country in the world does, right? The EU has an entire web of agreements. You've got the EU and Japan now. Throughout Asia, they've got all sorts of agreements with each other and with the EU, and we have a whole scheme of things. So you've got CPTPP, and the Latins have their agreements. So we already have a whole panoply of agreements outside the WTO. I would actually advocate that maybe we even look at. You could imagine down the line if we do a TTIP of sorts. That could be, the EU-Japan agreement already links that CPTPP with TTIP, say that 10 times fast, But the point is that I think we need the WTO as a floor, right? This is sort of the base level of what gets you to be a decent global citizen in the world. But as much as we can, with whoever we can, in as many areas as we can, we seek to really do what, the right things. And if a lot of that ends up excluding China, so be it. We need to do that.
Okay, pass the mic back. I'm going to take 2 more questions from that table because I think there were 2 more hands at this table. And then we're going to pause and let you guys jump in with your reactions to any or all of that. And then we'll go to the other tables.
My name is Hampton Dowling. I manage my own consulting firm. And I've always been a fan of Henry Kissinger. He he really articulated the idea about understanding linkages. And I noticed, if you take a note of President Trump's calendar, Henry Kissinger visits and talks with Trump quite a bit. Sort of other folks that have a rather contrarian view to the administration. It seems like there's a lot of interesting opinions flowing into the administration. And my business takes me from Central Asia to North Africa and down into Latin America. And my visits, my meetings with senior leadership of these countries, it's interesting how they ask about, they make the comment that they're not a fan of the WTO, and they're very enthusiastic about the U.S. taking a leadership role in bringing up conversations, driving some changes, and revealing warts. And some of them have actually mentioned about linkages and understanding what are the issues that need to be discussed in terms of driving reforms. And my question is, if, looking at things in a practical way, you're going to have a trade agreement between the 2 economies of the world that drive, 47% of the world economy, U.S. and China. That agreement, which will probably reveal itself this year, is probably going to drive more changes to global commerce than anything that's occurred since the end of World War II. It gets back to linkages and leverage. So if you have the reality of a trade agreement between those 2 economies, you have perhaps the denuclearization or the draft of it in North Korea, and you have the accelerated reclamation and development of islands in the South China Sea. You have this all in the background. How would, and this is the question I would pose, how would the U.S. take a leadership role in driving changes within the WTO? Because that is the organization that's in place. I don't know if we're able to transition from, like we did before, the League of Nations to the United Nations. Here we have the WTO. It is in place, flawed as it is, recognized by so many nations as fundamentally flawed, but it is there. So unless there is the willingness and the leverage in place to establish a new organization at pace, then what would the U.S. do with all these events in the background to drive useful, efficient changes within the WTO, consistent with the improvements and rules-based and all those things that, a lot of things that Derek was mentioning?
Was there another question at that table? I will give other tables a chance, but I just want to let these guys jump in as well. Is there anybody else there? Okay, let me just let you guys jump in. If you want to respond to.
Irv wants to say something.
Oh, I didn't see. Okay, all right, sir, Irv, go ahead.
Irving
Yeah.
Williamson, International Trade Commission. I just want to make a couple of points about, I think, the role of the WTO and dealing with other problems that we have to deal with, such as climate change. And if you think about how the TRIPS agreement was negotiated, basically, UNESCO, World Intellectual Property Organization, they wrote the substantive rules. What the WTO said is that you have to apply those rules. Health and safety measures. There are a whole bunch of organizations around the world that set standards for health and safety. And the WTO rules just say you can't use those rules to distort trade. So if you think the WTO has a function, but it's not going to solve the world's problems. A lot of the work that we really need to deal with, particularly on climate change, is not going to happen in the WTO. The WTO is just going to can make sure that those rules aren't abused to distort trade, and we're talking about trade. The other thing, small thing, but you think about the impact of failed states, developing countries that maybe are not functioning well. A lot of developing countries have acceded to the WTO. That process is very rigorous, and we have a lot more leverage than we had over China. That's helping their development, which is also helping our security because they follow rules of transparency, good governance, and things like that. Otherwise, they don't get into the WTO. If you're interested in developing countries, it's a terribly important function. And I've done a lot of work in these countries, so I've seen it firsthand. Those are things you just cannot discount. Now, some things are just too big for the WTO, and I think there are some trade problems, there are some political problems. And we'll have to accept that, but don't throw out the baby just because you can't solve all the problems with that one institution. Thank you.
Okay, great. Helpful comments. Cathy, Derek, do you want to respond to any of that? You don't have to answer everything, but just thoughts that provoke there. Yeah. Right.
That's impossible to answer everything, but I would say, just from my perspective, and I hope nobody misunderstood, was never thought or was trying to argue that the WTO is the only game in town. I totally agree with Rhett that there's lots of other things going on and in play, and it's important that those do go on. One question I would pose back, though, from my years at Apple and looking at all the digital issues is, we all say we need agreement on these digital issues. Got to have it. The but for me is, yes, except that the countries that you really want to agree are going to be the ones that are going to be the biggest problems. And so I don't know that just saying we want this agreement, it's needed, means that we're actually going to bring people to the table in some fundamentally different way. The problem of the WTO is going to be the problem of any, trying to get a multilateral agreement on digital issues, for example. It's going to be the same problem if you want all the big participants to come to an agreement. So I think, that just is out there. How do we do that? Well, those of us who negotiate for a living or did, it's a painful process, and it's not a quick process. And so I think whatever we undertake that's going to be on a large basis, we're going to get those rocks in the road no matter what we do. And I 1,000% agree with you, Irv, about developing countries and the rigorous process. And it's not the WTO as just sort of rules without content, but it is the market opening, transparency, public participation, kind of economic-based thing that the WTO drives in developing countries that helps to make a difference. Is the WTO the reason for globalization? Absolutely not. And I would never try to suggest it is. I think what it does is it can bring some stability, as can these other agreements. And I think I would agree that, you got to try to get like-minded people and agree where you can on things and hope that you can continue to enlarge those things. But none of this is a snap your fingers and it's all going to be fine.
Okay, great. Derek, fairly quickly.
Yeah. 3 remarks, 2 on what is the case and 1 on what should be the case. What is the case is that the top 4 finishers in the 2016 election were all opposed to TPP, and 3 of them were protectionists. I wouldn't put Hillary Clinton in that camp, but I would put the other three. And Ted Cruz changes his mind quickly about a lot of things. So let's say 2.5. Sorry, Senator Cruz. I have email from his staffer here, so I was thinking about this. But he flipped really hard on TPA. So I don't, I think you can make a case that we had 3 out of the last 4 being protectionist candidates, and certainly the winner is a protectionist. So saying that, like, well, we should, not change, too bad. Change has been made. And maybe it'll switch in 2020, but right now we have to act as if the U.S. is no longer satisfied with the status quo. Certainly, I testified on 6 times in front of Congress last year. I think of myself as being pretty aggressively critical of the status quo. Congress was outflanking me on a bipartisan basis. Not critical enough. You're not critical enough. So maybe this is temporary. You can bet on that. But right now, the U.S. There's very strong U.S. pressure to change the status quo, and not in minor ways. For the interest of time, maybe I'll just skip over to the what we should do. And just on what we should do, I'm sort of an idealist. If you think we should do something, then okay, let's fight for that regardless of prevailing political winds. But the WTO is not going to fix what I think are the major problems. It's not. There's no point saying it's going to take a long time, or we should try it, and wouldn't it be good if this is going to happen? The point of my initial presentation, it will not happen. Now, if you want to say there are other positive things about the WTO that outweigh those, we have a different assessment of American interests, that's fine. But let's not pretend that we're going to get changes from the Chinese and from the Indians on what I consider to be the key issues in globalization now, not 20 years ago, not 40 years ago, now. So that's the only caution I would say. What should, we have different agreements, different views about what should happen, and you could be absolutely right. But don't pretend that we're going to make progress in areas we're not going to make progress on. WTO has been dead for more than a decade. Come on. Don't pretend it's going to come back to life now.
Okay. All right. I saw this table at the back, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to harvest these questions very quickly and then give you each like a minute at the end. So the gentleman in the back, then I saw Amy, and then was there anybody on this side of the room? Okay, a gentleman there.
So I have a very simple question. One of the oldest arguments for freer trade is that a rising tide lifts all boats. And so my question is, should the United States continue to be a part or continue to support an organization which includes our strategic rivals and thus will lift their boats, so to speak?
That's a good question, and that's fundamental. I mean, the premise of the original order was that the rising, well, just what you said. And so I guess the question is, that's fundamental, and that's something maybe we'll circle back to in a sort of audience question at the end. Amy. And please offer, as you could, again, any thoughts about what specifically we should do here, either in reform or in starting over.
Amy Selico from Albright Stonebridge Group. I do have a specific question for you both, and I'm wondering if the WTO is going to offer any action-forcing event to either overcome, the premise that we should ignore the WTO or to help us really push for reform. And so the two cases that are before the WTO are, of course, the many countries that are suing the U.S. over the 232, and then, of course, market economy status for China. And I'm just wondering, when we think about, Matt, ways forward, are either of those cases going to offer a reckoning of sorts? The United States saying, we're going to withdraw from the WTO if you rule against us on having the sovereignty, the ability to protect our own national security the way we see fit, and on market economy status, which many of us believe was baked into the WTO accession agreement with China when they joined, that they were actually going to make enough changes to be considered a market economy at the end of a very long road. So that is my question. The other point I would just like to make while I have the microphone is I agree with Arit that the WTO, of course, is the floor for us as we think about what can we do with the global trading system, particularly when our two large economies have such divergent views on so many issues and so many similar views, like using national security to bleed into economic policy making. And so, again, the question to the comment from me being, how do we limit that without infringing on sovereignty? And is there a role at the WTO specifically for that question? I think tying back to, will the 232 case really be an action-forcing event?
All right, good comment. And then this gentleman here.
Supposed to stand? Oh, geez, more. Tom Stuber, formerly with the U.S. Dairy Export Council. My opinion to throw into this, and then a couple of suggestions at the end, is that we're moving too fast to come to a definite idea of what we should change. You talk about Xi Jinping or China being a disruptor. They are a disruptor. President Trump is a disruptor. I think if Xi Jinping had not been the president at that time, that a market economy and or developed economy would have been the natural outgrowth as originally adopted when the WTO, when they came in. So I think we're in a period of disruption. Both are trying to disrupt the system for their own advantage. I think we have a lot more to gain to stay, and I think while we figure out exactly what these solutions are, we should take the tools we have, which is to say crank up the dispute settlement process. The U.S. wins more than it loses. We should use those tools. We should add those things where we can and continue to try to figure out exactly what disruption is for the long term. This is, of course, what the Chinese have done. I think we're moving too fast here to think we need to fix it now. We need to figure this out. Secondly, in terms of two suggestions to think about here, one is where's the consensus on it? I think companies, and I used to head a trade association, a lot of companies involved in trade, they did not talk to their employees about the importance of trade. Unless you have employees understanding it and talking to their neighbors who may or may not understand or be hurt by it, then you don't get any grassroots spread. And then secondly, well, I guess I give my suggestion about dispute settlement, so that's what I would suggest to go forward.
Great. Were there other hands that I can't see because of the lights? There's a woman there, or Faye, right here, the woman with gray.
Fei Yu from the Asian Development Bank. I agree with what has been said, but I just want to caution about the harm of trying to push too hard on the WTO reform. If, like the idea of the floor, if you can keep the framework going, there's a lot of benefits of having the conversation, having the negotiation happening under this platform. If you drive the rules too hard, if you ramp up enforcement, and that may cause some breakup, like if one country withdraw from the WTO, that's more harm than having everybody in there already. And a lot of the issues that, especially the big players, are really much better dealt with under bilateral frameworks. For example, the China problem, the trade issue is linked really with the investment issue. So you can't really have these issues addressed under the WTO. So rather than having everything addressed in one place, it may even be better just have WTO as a mechanism with very selective enforcement, so with some flexibility, so that it won't drive countries away from it.
Great comments, and we've got, I think, 2.5 minutes, and we have a hard deadline at 11:45, right? No? The walls are going to start coming up, and scary things are going to start happening. Okay, I'm going to give each of these folks a chance to sort of wrap up, although, I really do want audience participation, so if there are other ideas, even as I'm sort of stalling here, I'd welcome more hands. But let me ask a question to the group that'll maybe prompt that, which is sort of a variation on my original theme, picking up on what Amy and the Rising Tides gentleman said, which is, again, a vote here. Do you think that the fundamental kind of deal in the WTO was, we'll cede a little sovereignty, tie our hands in order to get everybody else to tie their hands, to our sort of net benefit, even though, as part of that, rising all boats, okay, helping rise all boats. That was sort of the premise of the thing. Is that still fundamentally in the U.S. interest, or is that a raw deal for the United States? Is in some way we're not getting the net benefit of that sort of trade-off, if I've characterized appropriately what the kind of basic deal was, that we sacrifice a little sovereignty in order for everybody else to sacrifice sovereignty, and we have net benefit, and so do others, and all boats rise. So if you think that that's sort of the basic fundamentals of that deal is still a good thing for the United States on a net basis, please raise your hand. if you think that that basic approach is still a good thing. Okay, that's interesting. On the other hand, I want to challenge you on why you raised your hand. If you think that's a raw deal and it's not working for us, for Americans and for the United States, then raise your hand. No, kind of one or the, at least, all right, DL, go ahead, DL. Let DL have a microphone and let him explain that.
We're going to run out of time.
I know, but.
Yeah, no, I actually agree that that was the original thought in the deal. So I raised my hand, but is it still working to me? That's another question. And on that score, I think, no, we got a raw deal, but what we thought we were getting, I agree with that. We thought that, but it didn't.
Okay, no, I'm talking about today. Like, is it still working? Whether it worked or not in the past, today, is that deal still working for the United States? And so, if you don't think it's working, can you raise your hands again? If you think it's a raw deal and we're kind of losing out from this deal, and so there are a few hands here. But okay. Maybe Irv had another thought, and then this woman here, and then we're going to let these guys really wrap up, and hopefully the walls won't literally start coming up.
Just briefly, because I think it goes to Derek's criticism. I think the greatest threat to the U.S. competitiveness is failure to do economic reform, deal with income inequality and those issues. And a good trade policy starts with a good domestic economic policy.
Yep.
So I think that's the big picture.
Yep. Yep, I agree. That's a good point. This lady here. Hold on, just wait one sec, because they can't hear you online if you don't have a microphone. Thanks.
I'm Narmin Molazadeh from Cogent Law Group. I just recently joined the group, so I'm really not very, very professional and familiar as auditory. But you mentioned in your comment that generally we're giving money, and we supposed to be kind of leader in that. Didn't you think that it will be if we will start kind of making more pressure than China and Russia, which they tilting to go to cryptocurrency? So what we're going to do in this case? If,
okay. Sorry, do you finish the question?
Yes.
Okay, that's a big topic and something that I know you've got a lot to say on, but I don't want to, that's going to take too much time, a little bit off topic. It's a good question, and it's something that we're all kind of thinking about and working on. All right, one more, and then that's going to be the end, and then I'm going to take the...
Ryan's just going to come in here and kill you.
That's right. No, he's not waving his arms yet, so I think we're okay.
Hi, thanks for the very interesting discussion so far. I'm curious, Derek, I haven't heard the suggestion before that the US or anyone just ignore the WTO. And I'd be really interested in hearing you step through your thinking on what perhaps, say, the second and third order effects of that kind of approach might be when you take into account, say, the potential responses of other countries to the US ignoring the WTO, whether that's the US ignoring their commitments or ignoring the dispute settlement function and their ability to enforce their own rights. And also, I guess the third angle is the development of rules. How do you think those countries will react, and therefore what the impact will be for the US? Why do you not see that as a problem?
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's all we can take from the audience, but I want to give you guys each a chance to say maybe 90 seconds,
all right.
If they'll allow us.
So the first thing I'd say is I can't answer your question until we know what the U.S. thinks. And that gets back to my unilateral side. We're in a state of change in our approach to trade for good reason. It may be exploited by people saying silly things. I don't know who I could possibly be talking about, but there are good reasons for this. The world doesn't just not change from Bretton Woods start to now so that we keep the same institutions. So my answer to you is, how are we going to abuse the system? This gets back to Amy's point as well. When we ignore the WTO, because I don't see any value in just trying to actively destroy it, unless the WTO says China's a market economy. And I'm not disagreeing with you that we may have embedded that agreement, except it's a lie. China is not a market economy. So I don't want to be part of an organization that binds American policy with a lie that actually matters. If they want to say Bolivia is a market economy, maybe I don't care, but not China. So, at the same time, I don't want us abusing the national security exemption for 232. So I'm sitting, I disagree. with members of Congress who, we agree 100% on one thing and completely disagree on another. We haven't settled where we're going. If we haven't settled where we're going, I can't answer your question about what the secondary violations are going to be. I'll give you ground. I am not saying that ignoring the WTO has no consequences. I'm not saying there isn't going to be blowback to the U.S., but I don't know what it is, because the first thing we need to do is fix our own house with regard to economic policy, but also with regard to what we want to do on trade. And that's why maybe if I were to, I know I have to stop. Here's a compromise position of sorts. Ignore the WTO in the sense of putting it aside. Decide what we want to do here. Go back to the WTO. Don't pretend we're going to reform it. It's not going to happen. But decide what we want to do here without prejudice or bias in favor of the WTO. That's the alternative I'm arguing for. And once we decide what we want to do here, I can tell you what the costs are. I don't think there should be any cost for not saying China's a market economy, because it's not a market economy. I think there will be costs if we start abusing the national security exemption. But in either case, I want to go with what the U.S. consensus is, and it's not the same thing as it was 20 years ago.
Great, excellent. Cathy?
Well, I think that it really isn't an either or. I think it is an and. And so to me, it is, we need to, I would agree, we need to think about what's in our interest. I think we need to base that on facts and looking at our economy ourselves, and then saying, okay, what are the tools we have, and using those tools. And if you're gonna build a structure, you don't only just use a jackhammer. You use lots of tools to build things. And so similarly, the WTO is one of those tools, and there's lots of other ones. And I think we have to think about how do we use those in a way that is going to better our own interest. And I guess I would argue that I do still think that a rising tide does lift all boats, and that we need to think about that. Just one last thing I would say, and that is I started listening for America because of the seeming support for protectionism that came from the election and from those who are running. And I wanted to find out, is that really what people think? And granted, I have not talked to every single voter, but interestingly, I have found out that that is not what people really think. Instead, people are extremely unsettled by trade wars, and mostly people just want to know what the facts are, and they feel they don't know those. And so, riding to the sound of the guns, and that all gets everybody's blood boiling. But in the end of the day, I just haven't found a whole lot of people who are saying, yeah, let's go blow everything up. That's just what we found so far.
Excellent. Okay, lots to think about there, lots of food for thought. Impossible to summarize, and I have to do that in the next session. So anybody have any suggestions about how to summarize it, please come to me during the lunch break. We're now supposed to go up to the Sam Nunn Terrace and collect a lunch box, or is it a buffet? I'm not sure. Anyway, there's lunch up there, and you can bring it back once the walls have come up again. You can come back in here and eat it at the table. And then we're going to start again at 12:20 or something, 12:20. We're going to resume up here. Oh, you can come right back in. The walls, going up is not dangerous. I see. All right, good. Thanks, Bill. All right, thank you.